Welcome to the Manchester Festival of Libraries and this Inspired by Libraries talk hosted by Urmston Library here. I'm Catherine Fletcher, Professor of History at Manchester Metropolitan University. Then I'm delighted to introduce our guest this evening, who is Greg Jenner. Greg is the host and creator of the chart-topping BBC podcast, Youre Dead to Me, which has had 30 million downloads, as well as the presenter of BBC Radio 4's Past Forward, A Century of Sound, the BBC's History podcast for children, which some of you may have heard through lockdown, Homeschool History, and the Audible series, A Somewhat Complete History of Sitting Down. Prior to that, he was historical consultant responsible for fact-checking horrible histories. That's over 2,000 sketches and 140 songs across 9 series and a movie, quite a lot of work. And he's the author of several books. How Does He Find the Time? Dead Famous, An Unexpected History of Celebrity, A Million Years in a Day, A Curious History of Ordinary Life. And a little bit later on this evening, we're going to be talking about his latest book, which he has got a copy of there to hold up. Ask a Historian, 50 Surprising Answers to Things You Always Wanted to Know. But before we get into the details of the book, and indeed there'll be a chance for you to ask questions later on, I want to start talking a little bit about libraries and ask, well, what do libraries mean to you?
Big
question.
Yeah, I've immediately run out of steam. I think libraries are one of those extraordinary inventions that if we didn't already have them, people wouldn't let you invent them. Because they're so powerful and so valuable and so important, but they don't make money, so why would we keep them? But they have an extraordinary history, and they are interwoven into the history of the world. And all the great civilizations of the world had libraries and maintained their knowledge and kept their knowledge. And that was sort of the origins of what a library is for. And then more recently, libraries have become more than just storehouses of stuff and information and knowledge. They've become centers of communities and of interactions between peoples, between, communities coming together to take a book out, but also to, gather, learn stuff, meet each other, have a natter, access vital services, go to, prepare for job interviews and things like that. And I think that's something that libraries often do perhaps a little bit quietly and not everyone realizes. My wife works in heritage and libraries and archives, and I'm aware of how much hard work goes into keeping these buildings going and making them so invaluable, but they are often undervalued and often under attack from certain governments whose ethics advisors are resigning. And so the history of libraries is extraordinary in its own right. And then I think when you get to the modern day iteration of what a library is for, I think it takes on an even more important power as being a place where everyone is welcome. And so as a kid, I loved going to my local library. I used to just go in there and just read everything.
Do you have a particular memory of a highlight of those?
Yeah, I remember that my local library had all the Asterix books in English and French, which was very fancy. And I'm half French, so that's sort of how I learned to read French a bit, was by cross-referencing the jokes and realizing the French got different jokes to the English version. You're like, hang on a minute, there are new jokes in this one. And it's because the puns don't work in English. And so, get a fix is a great joke in English, but in French it means nothing. And obviously it's originally in French first. So as a kid I didn't understand that. I thought it was an English thing that the French had stolen.
One of those are named after French car insurance in French version, something like that. And it's funny in French, it just wouldn't work.
No, and they're so brilliantly translated. And so I remember, sort of as probably 7 or 8 years old, going to the local library in my village in Kent, where I grew up, and just sort of going, oh, you've got all the Asterix books. Oh, you've got more. You've got French Asterix books. All right, I'll enjoy that. I read my first history book in a library. It was Simon Schama's History of the French Revolution, Citizens. It's probably the reason I became a historian. So libraries are really important to me, and as a medieval history student at York University, I spent a lot of time in the library, not always studying, I'll admit. It had pretty good Wi-Fi, so that was... and also we occasionally would steal the toilet roll, I have to admit, I'm sorry. I'll atone for it one day. But I think libraries are really important in their spaces, yeah. And
so how do libraries now feed into writing the books, preparing the podcast and so on?
Well, hugely. I mean, so I'm a member of what's called the London Library, which is a private members library, which is very fancy. I've never actually been. It's this amazing building in London, but they send the books to me, which during the pandemic was incredible, because how on earth do you write a book in a pandemic? Well, some hard-working librarians were still at work sending out books. So the only reason this exists is because I was a member of a library, and that also gave me access to digital information, digital journal articles, collections, so I could access a fantastic array of scholarship and the works of various historians and all sorts of things, and I could do it safely from my house while we were all dealing with a very scary situation. So again, testament to the hard work and diligence of people who did that, who went to work and sent out stuff so I could write books.
And what's the best library you've ever been to?
The best library? Well, there are some beautiful ones. Prague has got a phenomenal library, which you just sort of want to touch everything, and they're like, please don't touch the library. Oh, it's so pretty. At York, as a master's student doing medieval studies, there's a brilliant library there which is full of medieval manuscripts and extraordinarily beautiful things. Because medieval manuscripts, the Latin word manuscript means literally written by hand, manus. And so you see in those documents, in those beautiful 600, 700 years old things, you see not just the handwriting, someone's hand is cramping and you can see their hand getting tired as they get to the end of the page. You can also see sometimes the collarbone where the cow or the sheep died and the skin was stretched off them and then turned into vellum. So you can sometimes see in the physical books in these libraries the story of that book that began before the monk or the scribe even began writing it. And obviously that's sad to think about the poor animal, but that is an amazing thing. And so these libraries that hold these extraordinary books are my favourites because they're just full of treasures.
And do you have a best historical fact about libraries?
Well, I mean, libraries they've got an amazing history of their own right. So the oldest ones go back to the Bronze Age. One of the most famous ones is Ashurbanipal, who was an Assyrian king. We all know our Assyrian kings, don't we? We can name them. So this was about 2,700 years ago. He had this library of about 30,000 documents. They're all made on, so they're written, but they're in cuneiform and they're in clay. So we tend to think of books on paper, but they are, you take a triangular shaped pen and you make triangle shapes into clay and then you bake it. And then you get this knowledge that just lives forever because it's baked. And archaeologists have found it and dug it up, and all those things are available. He put a curse on anyone who stole a book. So obviously a library fine is probably a few pounds, but he said if you steal a book, the gods will come after you, and they know where you live. So I guess Ashurbanipal, he invented the original, make sure to return to library, please. But I mean, they're really, really interesting in terms of their history and what they're for. And 1850 is the kind of the Public Libraries Act here in the UK, England and Wales at least, which invents the idea of the public library for everyone. And that's a super important year. It's during that sort of phase in the 19th century where you're getting all these radical acts, all these incredibly important rules where Victorians are like, well, on the one hand, children are great down mines, but on the other, we feel maybe we shouldn't put them all down the mine. So you get the Education Reform Acts, you get the Factory Acts, you get the Great Reform Act of 1832. But 1850, right in the middle of the century, is this Libraries Act that says, all right, any town with 10,000 people needs a library. And later on, it's any town with 5,000 people needs a library. And you also get the emergence of benefactor donations as well. So you get people like Andrew Carnegie, who's one of the wealthiest men in the world at the time, sort of Elon Musk without the kind of bell-end sort of egotism. And he was donating libraries all over the place. And so you get this really interesting, particularly in the 1880s and 1890s, during the Jubilee year, Queen Victoria, when she has her big Jubilees, loads of libraries opening up. And it's all about the idea of self-improvement, offering opportunities, giving the working classes. It was often slightly like, posh white dudes saying, I've given you a library. But it was also about ensuring that communities could educate themselves, people could lift themselves out of poverty, they could learn to read and write, but they could also go and enjoy novels. They could go and read about faraway places that have been conquered and colonized, unfortunately, but also just expand their horizons. And that's a super important part of the history of libraries, is that it connects people up to the wider world. The really interesting thing about libraries in that period, though, is that the architects who get all these commissions to build these new libraries are like, yes, all right, fantastic, we'll do a Greco-Roman, we'll do a Greco-Roman and a Greco-Roman, and I can do you 3 Greco-Romans for a £5, and these amazing, beautiful buildings, but they're all like quite awkwardly designed and not very well laid out to be a library. So in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, you see a very different style of library in terms of architecture. So it's a new sort of building, so it needs its own architecture. And I'm sure the librarians in this building can tell you that actually there's a flow to buildings, and libraries have their own rhythms, and you can see where people are going and where books need to go. And so it takes a while for those buildings to become functioning spaces and not just very beautiful Doric column up the front and a sort of Latin motto on the door. So yeah, the history of libraries is super interconnected with all the other histories that are happening at the same time.
Let's talk about the book. Let's talk about the book. Let's talk. I know we do. Now, I think people want to know. You want to know about the book, don't you? Yeah, we all know the book. And you just say you wrote this through lockdown. Yeah. With, I guess, what you could find online and what you brought in, what you got sent in from the London Library. But that must have been quite a challenge. Yeah,
so the idea of the book was, the previous book I'd written was called Dead Famous, and I was going to go and tour it around the UK and do like a kind of 50-minute lecture, point to some slides, and then at the end I was going to ask the audience to ask me anything at all, any historical question you have, and I would do my best to answer it, but I would write it down, go home, turn it into a book. That was the idea. And then COVID just ruined everything. Dead Famous came out 4 days before COVID, which was slightly awkward timing. After 4 years of work, I was like, oh no! But everything was just so serious and so much more important. It's like, okay, fine, scrap Dead Famous, moving on. And so this book became a way of trying to stay in touch with like people, because I just felt very like lonely in my house with my wife and my toddler, and we didn't leave the house. And so this was a way of going, okay, I can still talk to people through Twitter, and so ask everyone, what do you want to know? And so I got 640 questions, I think, about 300 about Anne Boleyn, so that was sort of quite quickly, just, Anne Boleyn and Hitler, everyone's favourites. Quite the double act. But it was really, really interesting. And as you say, I was writing it during lockdown, at the same time as writing another book and at the same time as making podcasts. So I was quite busy. I wrote 500,000 words in 2021, so I had quite a busy year. But I was also being supported by my team on the podcast, and my wife was being amazing looking after my daughter, so I was able to sort of just focus on this book a bit. But it's a really interesting challenge, and it was quite hard to be funny. It's hard to be funny anyway, you can probably tell. But it's quite hard to be funny when the news was so relentlessly sad, and I knew people who were getting really ill, I knew people who died. It was really a challenging time. So I found writing it quite therapeutic, because it gave me something to do, a sort of a targeted challenge. And I also felt like I was in dialogue with people, even though I wasn't able to see them or talk to them through Twitter and so on. I could sort of chat, and occasionally I would phone up a historian such as yourself and go, I don't know what I'm doing, this question's hard, someone's asked me about this. So it's a really interesting thing, I suppose. Yeah, and there are some really interesting questions in the book. I mean, one that was slightly locally topical is the one about Atlantis and the aliens, because there's been a rumour for a while that there may be an ancient aliens theme park near Blackpool, and God, yes, I forgot about that. And it seems to have gone off the boil at the moment. But why are ancient aliens just so problematic? Oh, how long have you got? Okay. Atlantis is a really interesting idea, and it's got an extraordinary history, and it's got a cultural history much bigger than the story itself, because it has an ancient chapter, which you can probably all guess what that is, and then it's got this 19th and 20th century version as well, and then it's got this 21st century version. So the very long and the short of it is that Atlantis is a myth made up by Plato to win an argument, classic Plato. And we have very little evidence for it, but the story is that it's a sort of huge superpower off the coast of somewhere. But what's really interesting is that you get this cultural legacy that continues. So one of the first things, you're a Renaissance scholar, one of the first things that happens when Columbus sort of bumps into the New World and decides it's India, the Spanish conquistadors, while they're doing horrific, horrible things, they sort of get into Mexico, and one of the first questions that's asked back in Europe is this Atlantis? which is extraordinary because this is a story told 2400 BCE, and yet, you know, in the Renaissance in post-1490s, it's back.
And that's their point of reference, you know. If it's in the classical manuscripts, then,
it
you
must
know,
be
it's
true.
that's where you're going to go for your expert knowledge on all sorts of things.
So in the Renaissance, they're rediscovering this idea, but then what happens in the 19th century is it gets rediscovered again, but it gets this sort of added eugenics idea. And so you get people like Helena Blavatsky, who's the founder of the Theosophical Society, who's a sort of mystic, and various Germanic writers and things who argue that Atlantis was a sort of superpower alien race, and the people of Atlantis had superpowers, and they had telekinesis, they could mind read, they could wield electricity. They were aliens, essentially. And she says that they were sort of in India. Later on, you get a guy called Hans Herbiger, who was a crackpot, basically, he was like a self-taught inventor in Austria. And he said that the universe was made of ice, and that the world was made of when a giant ice ball smashed into another ice ball. And it's absolutely bonkers, but this theory gained quite a lot of traction in Germany, and became one of the founding tenets of this alternative cultural institute that was designed to try and find and prove that the Aryan race was superior to all other races, and which situated this, again, divine sperma, these alien superpower beings, the Atlanteans, the Aryans, situated them further north in India and moved them up into Scandinavia. And so what happened is you get archaeology in the 1930s trying to prove that Aryans were better and had conquered certain lands, which meant that Hitler might then be able to invade them. So Atlantis has this weird story where it sort of starts in an ancient world as a sort of case study of like, don't get big, and you know, it's an anti-imperial allegory. Then in the Renaissance, it's like, oh, it might be a thing. It could be the New World, and then it ends up being this story that gets sucked into the horrific ideology of the Holocaust, and you know, because it's this notion that Aryan people are superior because they are divine aliens, and everyone else is descended from chimps. So it's this way of being able to separate white people from Jews, from Slavs, from people of African heritage, black African heritage. You know, it's a way of saying we're better, which then underpins the horrors of the Holocaust. So Atlantis is sort of like fun, and when it's in Aquaman, you know, the Aquaman movie, it's fine. I like the Aquaman movie. It's good. It's fine. It's fine. It's Little Mermaid. It's in there. You can find it in Stargate. You know, it's all over pop culture, but it's got this really sinister history that people don't know. So that's quite.
Then we get this stuff like that the aliens must have built the pyramids.
They must have built the pyramids.
Nobody in North Africa could be that capable. And
yeah,
there's a lot of that.
They must have built the pyramids. I just did a podcast a couple of days ago about people saying the aliens maybe built the tomb of the first emperor of China. It's like, come on, how busy were these aliens? I mean, they're sort of Stonehenge next. I've got to get round to Bulgaria. Got to, you know. Yeah, this sort of idea that ancient civilizations were not smart enough to build their own monuments is an innately racist idea. It's basically saying, well, those people, they couldn't have done it. But there's a huge amount of evidence that Egyptians built their own pyramids, you know, including diaries written by ancient Egyptians. So we know who does it.
Yeah, now I want to ask about this whole concept of ancient, because this is another concept that comes up in the book. You know, we've just been saying ancient, medieval, Renaissance, but who gets to name these historical periods? Like, how did we end up with these categories? Yeah,
so one of the questions was who names historical periods, and what will our era be called by future historians? And just having had a jubilee last week, it's a really good question, isn't it? Because actually, well, okay, let's poll the room. How would you feel if in 25 years' time everyone says, right, well, you're all new Elizabethans because you all lived through Queen Elizabeth II? Does that feel appropriate? So I mean, are you all right with that? Hands up if you feel like you're a new Elizabethan.
Johnsonian.
Johnsonian. Yeah, so we're all Borisites. Yeah, I mean, that is currently probably the leading candidate for what we'll be called. But eras are architectural sort of gerrymandering that are applied intellectually by historians after the fact to try and make sense of the chaos of the past. There is so much vastness, and we try and order it, but historians are not very good at checking in with other historians about what you're working on. You're a Renaissance scholar. What is the Renaissance? Exactly. Exactly. And I'm a medievalist by training, and if someone says, what is medieval history? I go, sort of 476 to 1485 or 1517, depending on what you define. But I mean, that's the Renaissance, right?
Tough question.
Okay, and ancient history, well, I mean, how late do you want to go? How early do you want to go? We have this thing called late antiquity. We've got ancient, we've got ancient, we've got, then the Stone Age. What's that? I mean, that was invented in 1862 as a concept. So the dating of the world, you can go back a long way, and St. Augustine of Hippo divided the world up into 6 ages, 5 of which were pre-Jesus, and then the 6th age was Jesus, second coming. And they're like, well, he hasn't come back yet, depending on who you ask. But so he'd left not much space for everything else after him. But then in the Middle Ages and so on, there's a Renaissance scholar called Bruni, I think, who gives us the idea of ancient, medieval, modern. Petrarch invents the Renaissance, sort of, and the idea of Dark Ages, which we do not use in this room. And so historians, we have to make sense of the world, we have to put divisions in. But it's a ludicrous concept. 1250 is where the High Middle Ages ends. Like what, January 1st, everyone's like, I'm done being High Middle Ages. And the Tudor era is also the Stuart era, if you ask a Scottish person. But in England, it's like, no, the Tudor era, we're all Tudors today. There's all these overlaps, there's the Enlightenment. I mean, when does the First World War end? Anyone? Give us your best, go on. I won't shout, I promise. 1918? Yeah? It's 1918? Sure. That's not true. The First World War technically ends 1920. In America, 1921. Possibly 1922, depending on your definition. Legally speaking, Robert Gerwath, who's a German historian, very, very brilliant historian, who's written a fantastic book, he argues the First World War ends in 1923. It's a pretty convincing argument. So we can't even agree on when the First World War ends. Also, it's not even the First World War, because the 7 Years' War of 1756 to 63 is the First World War. It's fought in North America, it's fought in India, it's fought in Europe simultaneously by the same powers. It's a global war. So historians are chaos engines. We are so bad at agreeing on a rubric with everyone else in our team, and we're like, yeah, I'm just working on this period, and I'll call it this. It's like, no, because I'm working on that period, and I've called it that.
It gets really vicious.
It's really tricky.
Yeah, it was a huge argument. I mean, at London, University of London at one point, the Renaissance seminar got renamed the Late Medieval and Early Modern Seminar by people who objected on principle to the name Renaissance. So,
modern history starts what, 1603? That's when modern history starts. But early modern starts, what, 1485? So that's like just sort of squeeze into like 100 years.
No, but in Italy, modern history starts with the Renaissance.
Right.
So Storia Moderna is the Renaissance onwards. I mean, everything before that is medieval, right? So
we shouldn't be trusted. We should not be given power. So what will our era be called in the future is not up to us. It's what our descendants will call us. And that's the thing. You can try really hard to name your own era. The Victorians succeeded, and so did the Enlightenment. So Was ist Aufklärung is a text written by Kant where he is like, I'm going to call it the Enlightenment and everyone's going to agree, it's going to be great. And the Victorians call themselves Victorians. But we don't really get to decide what we get called. And so the future may have some pretty strong words for us given what we've done to the planet and what we've done to our economy. So who knows what we'll be. But I'm not sure about New Elizabethans. Doesn't work for me.
Well, there's also some more very kind of practical questions in the book. They're much more, seem much more straightforward, but no doubt you're going to tell me that they're actually terribly complicated. Like, who was the first vegetarian?
Oh, God, yeah, so we don't know. I mean, who, yeah, because that's such a great question, because obviously I think many of us are starting to think ethically about the food we eat and where we want to get it from and how we want to hopefully think about the future of the planet and ourselves and our souls and how we want to, and this also is a revolution that seems to happen about 2,500 years ago. The first vegetarian, I cannot tell you, but there are several major world religions which embrace vegetarianism at the same time in different places. And so it depends where you look, but you can look at Zoroaster, who is the founder of Persian Zoroastrianism. He seems to be a very early candidate, maybe. But you can look at certainly Pythagoras, who's the most famous vegetarian until Hitler stole the... It's not great, is it, when Hitler steals your thunder? You're like, really, Hitler? Oh, God. But he was obviously an ancient Greek mathematician, but he was more known for his cult. He ran an odd cult that believed in the reincarnation of souls into beans. So you weren't allowed to eat beans in case you were eating his friend. Famously, he died, people wanted to murder him, and he was running away, and he didn't want to run through a bean field in case he trampled any of his mates. And so his attackers caught up with him and stabbed him. But so he was incredibly famous until like the 1930s as the guy who did vegetarianism. So if you went to someone in a pub and said, I'm a Pythagorean, they would be like, oh, you don't eat meat. So this is a sort of ancient Greek mathematician, so it's a sort of really odd thing that his name persisted. Leonardo da Vinci, probably vegetarian, but we've had this conversation before, and we're like, we think.
Probably on balance.
Probably on balance.
Hard to say, yeah.
But certainly, it's often been said that ancient Egyptian priests were vegetarians, and then archaeologists and Egyptologists started looking at ancient Egyptian mummies, particularly priests, and the DNA and osteological and dietary analysis was like, no, these guys are eating so much meat that they're actually dying of heart attacks at 50. So they're the opposite of like clean living priests. They are basically Elvis in the 70s. They're just... So there is definitely a kind of a really interesting moment about 2500 BCE where you have Buddhism, Taoism, Zoroastrianism, Greco-Persian faiths all seeming to suddenly start talking about vegetarianism as part of their faith. So we're not sure who the first one is, but it seems to be around there, which is interesting.
One of the things I like about the book is you try to get a bit of a global picture and get away from the kind of, some of the standard school history books, which are quite kind of Western oriented still. And so you've got questions like, China is massive. If the emperor died or a new law was passed, how long did it take for news to reach everyone? Which is a question that just never occurred to me. It's a really good question.
Isn't it a great question?
It's a really good question.
Yeah, so... I've just done a podcast about the first emperor, and one of the extraordinary things about the first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huangdi, he died having desperately tried to live forever. That was his ambition, which is a good ambition, but quite hard to pull off. And he died midway on a tour, and his advisors were desperate not to tell anyone, because that's how you get a coup. The emperor is dead, who's going to take over next? Oh no, don't let anyone know. So they had to fake that he was still alive. So they carried on with the tour, and he didn't leave his carriage. And to cover up the smell of the rotting body, they surrounded him with fish, weirdly. And so they sort of got away with it. But the interesting thing is it took about 10 days for news of his death to reach the entire empire once they decided to release the news. Now that's extraordinarily fast. It took about 12 days to get news to Scotland, depending on when you sent it from England. It could take that long. But in China, this enormous empire, they had this phenomenal postal system. They had a variety of postal systems. They had, you could send a man, not just one man, he'd be very tired, but a series of men. You could send a horseback rider. You could send a series of horseback riders. And there were 4 different, almost like first class, second class, third class, and also airmail, I guess. There were like 4 classes of speed of letter sending or whatever. And so they could cover over 100 miles in a day on horseback, going round the clock. The messengers would have little bells on their ankles so that people would hear them coming, so the next messenger would be ready. The postal system was carefully regulated with punishments, so if anything happened, they would be brutally punished. They might lose a year's wage, which is pretty ruthless. But yeah, in the 14th century, the Yuan dynasty, I think it is, they could get a message across China in under 9 days. From edge to edge. This vast empire, but this incredible road building scheme and this round-the-clock postal system. And the Persians had a similar one called the Anga Rayon, which was equally brilliant and incredible. So these empires had these infrastructure that were amazing, and you see something similar in the 19th century with the invention of what was called, well, there's a couple of names for it, but essentially to get a letter across America from East Coast to West Coast. If you think about people going west towards California with the gold rush, to get a letter across, you'd have to just hand the letter to a man who'd get on a horse and would keep changing horses, and he'd change and change and change, and you'd slowly get that letter across America. And so They launched this process in like the 1860. Within a year, it was dead because they'd invented the telegram. The ability to send that message by cable just overnight changed it. And so this phenomenal revolution in the 19th century of telegraphy, which is from the ancient Greek, it means far away writing, tele, far away, graphy, writing, it just changes the world. The Crimean War, it took 40 days for news of the Crimean War 40 days for news of the Indian War of Rebellion, which sometimes people call the Indian Mutiny, 40 days for news of that to reach Britain. But the Crimean War, they'd installed a telegraph cable. It was in London that afternoon. So the first ever war correspondent was writing for the Times. He was able to file reports back to London about the battle that happened that morning. So it just changed the world overnight.
And go back to this Chinese emperor. He's going to be featured in the podcast
he is,
very shortly. But how do you go about picking the topics for the podcast?
Well, it's a sort of chaotic, maddening argument with myself and with my team about what do we want to do. We have to do 16 episodes per series. The show's called Youre Dead to me. It's on the BBC. If you haven't heard it, you've been on. We're a comedian and a historian and myself, and we have a chat about a different subject each time. And I try, where possible, to make sure that in those 15 episodes, and my colleagues Emma and Emmy help very carefully as well to sort of regulate my chaotic shoutings. But we want a really good mix of things. Global history, stories you've never heard, stories you definitely have heard, but you probably have been told myths. We want to make sure that there's histories of women, histories of black people, indigenous peoples, LGBTQ histories, like just making sure you're telling stories that don't usually get told. We're a comedy show, which means sometimes you have to be very careful with the ethics of what stories you tell and where you're laughing, because you don't always laugh at sad, painful things. And then it's about global versus British or European, ancient, medieval, modern. We also try and do social history, so we'll do something weird like the history of ice cream or the history of high heel shoes. We're doing the history of timekeeping on this series, which is one of my favorite nerdy subjects. So yeah, it's a blend of trying to make sure that you're not just getting the stuff you usually get in the curriculum or on the telly, which is endless Anne Boleyn and Hitler and Churchill stuff. So yeah, it's a big old... I've got a list of 96 ideas for Series 6 at the moment.
Oh, wow.
And we've got to whittle that down to 15. So.
And are there any topics that really surprised you when you came to researching for the podcast?
Yeah, I think the thing about history that's amazing, I guess, is that you can sometimes think you know a subject pretty well, even as a historian, and there are still things that absolutely take me by surprise. The episode we did about Paul Robeson, who was an extraordinary figure in the 20th century. I knew a fair bit about him. I just didn't know how incredible he was. And he was this prodigious, brilliant singer, a baritone, a gorgeous, deep voice, but he was also multilingual, taught himself language after language after language. He loved Russia. This was during the Cold War, where Russia was the absolute enemy. And I had no idea. I knew he was fondly remembered in Wales. I had no idea how beloved he is in Wales. This is an African-American man who was from New York State, came to Britain in his 20s, and befriended the Welsh people and did a transatlantic concert over the phone with them, where he, like a sort of Zoom gig, in the pandemic, we're all doing kind of Zoom gigs. And it's the most moving, beautiful thing, this Welsh choir singing a song to him down the phone line, and him singing back. And I just didn't know the depth of his impact on the world. And there's a mountain named after him. What a figure, what an amazing life. And quite a sad ending. The CIA really sort of went after him, but yeah. And
how different is the experience of doing Youre Dead to me from what you did previously on horrible histories?
Yeah.
Did you learn a lot from that previous experience to bring into it, or did you get more freedom?
No, that's a good question, actually. No one's asked me that before. Oh no. Horrible histories was an amazing thing, and I've done it for 14 years. I've stopped doing it now, but that was an amazing, brilliant thing where I got to tell stuff to a room full of funny writers, and they had to make it funny. And I guess the challenge on Youre Dead to me is I have to make it funny, so I'm not delegating so much. But I guess we learned a lot about what you can do with comedy, That you can approach really complicated, difficult ideas and still be funny. And sometimes actually, the funnier you go for, the easier it is to understand the complicated ideas. I've often assumed that hard things you have to sort of stop and go, and now for a hard thing. But actually comedy is a really good way of exploring really weird, big, massive histories or small micro histories. And I think Youre Dead to me is a brilliant training ground for that. And Horrible History is a brilliant training ground for that. And then with Youre Dead to me, the amazing thing is then being able to bring on professors who know what they're talking about and to still apply the same joking rhythms, but actually then to get into the really nitty-gritty stuff that you wouldn't do for a 7-year-old, because as much as 7-year-olds enjoy horrible histories, they're not such sort of big fans of bibliographies or footnotes, really. Although Rattus is technically footnotes. That's how he works. So Youre Dead to me is a sort of taking the kind of the idea of making history celebratory and enjoyable and fun, and then saying, okay, but how would you do it if you didn't? You're not dumbing down at all. You're just doing jokes as well. And that's the idea, is that it's basically a university lecture, but there's a comedian disrupting things.
And you were actually going back to more children's stuff for the next project.
Yeah, so I've written a kids' book, which I thought would be really easy. It was really hard. I thought it'd be a doddle, because you see people write kids' books, celebrities, and you're like, yeah, they've probably done it in an afternoon. It took me 2.5 years. So it's about the history of daily life for a child and all the 50 things they might use in a day, and where those things come from. Because, children's lives are so full of history without them realizing, and all of us in this room without us realizing where half of the things come from. And those are global histories. So often the things we think of as not global histories are global histories, whether that's the story of tomatoes, the story of curry, the story of cotton. Here we are in Cottonopolis. So actually it's really lovely to be able to work with an illustrator. I'm not at all used to working in Illustrator, so I was like writing my stupid jokes, and then I'd get an email going like, I have to draw that, It's like, I'm so sorry. Okay, let's back up on that. But a really, really lovely thing, I think, because I love social history. I love ordinary things. I love telling the stories of ordinary things. The history of underpants is the best history. It's so... Okay, how many underpants was Tutankhamun buried with in his tomb? Anyone? 7? It's a good guess. That's a week, right? Go slightly higher than 7. Anyone? No? 145 spare pairs. That's too many. Or it's not enough. If you're living for eternity, that's not enough. But it's such a niche number. I
can give you a Venetian courtesan who comes pretty close to having those numbers of underwear in her trunks. 64 linen shoes.
64. Like there we go. So the history of pants is like a great micro history, because it gets you into all sorts of questions of gender, about technology, about who's wearing them, where they're wearing them, what do you call them. But I love the ordinary. I love the banal. I love the history of paper clips. In World War II, when the Nazis invaded Norway, students resisted by wearing a paperclip, and that's how you knew you were resisting the Nazi occupation, because paperclips were believed at the time to have been invented by a Norwegian inventor. Actually, they were an American invention, and the students didn't know that. But it was a unifying symbol of holding two things together. The paperclip holds paper together, and the students who wore that would walk around and they'd see other people, and they all knew together we're going to stand up to these Nazis. So there's a statue in Norway of a big paperclip. And you think, paperclips are boring. You're like, no, paperclips were a symbol of the absolute bravery of young people who stood up to the most terrifying invasion possible. So even boring things like stationery has this big story. There's going to be possibly, unless we can stop it, a Eric von Daniken themed theme park. And Eric von Daniken was is he alive?
I genuinely don't know.
He might be alive. He is the guy who wrote this book called Chariots of the Gods, that in the 1960s was a huge bestseller, sold in the millions and millions and millions, and made the argument that Stonehenge, various sort of ancient global monuments were all built by aliens. And that has sort of fed then into Hollywood, it's fed into Stargate Atlantis and Nicolas Cage movies, but it's also gone into documentaries. Like you know, you used to work in television, I've worked in television for many years. A lot of American TV channels really enjoy programs called Ancient Aliens and so on, which are like, did Egyptian pyramids come from space? And it's a genuine documentary program. And I just, you know, for me, that's a really alarming thing because of that darker history I talked about, but also because we know it wasn't aliens. We just know, we've got all this amazing evidence. The Egyptians built their own pyramids. We know how they did it. We know when they did it. We know where they got the stone from. So, yeah.
It's a little bit like, what, you know, when did Hitler really die in the bunker?
Oh, God.
Yeah.
Is he alive now? No, he's not alive now. Is he a RoboCop? Yeah, well, maybe. So that, I mean, you know, it's fun when Hollywood does it. I don't mind it when movies do it. It's fine when Prometheus is crap, but Prometheus in theory is fine. But when documentaries do it, I do get quite despairing because this stuff matters. There's an American college in California that every year surveys Americans, and it's called the Survey of American Fears, and they ask people the same question every year. Do you believe in aliens? Do you believe aliens built the pyramids? Or do you believe Atlantis was real? And the number of people who believe in aliens, believe that Atlantis is real, believe that aliens built Atlantis, has grown steadily since 2016, year on year. And that's partially to do with Trump, it's partially to do with the culture, it's partially to do with the internet and YouTube and algorithms. So if you find something on YouTube and it's quite interesting and you quite like it, YouTube will give you 19 more of those, and you end up in a kind of in a cycle of being told over and over and over that yes, Atlantis was real, it wasn't, and it was built by aliens, it wasn't. So yeah, it's an interesting challenge as a historian to try and combat that. Oh no! It's tricky, isn't it? I think there's loads and loads of ones that I'd like to nuance gently, sort of. I think one of the ones that's really interesting is that there's a definite perception that people in the Middle Ages were dirty. There's this sort of absolutely, whenever there's a TV drama on about like the medieval people, I see loads of tweets. I'm like, I can't believe their teeth are so nice. And they were. I mean, London, Paris in the 14th century had 40 or 50 bathhouses. Soap was available. It was called Castilian soap. It had come through from Syria and Lebanon, where it was sort of first invented. People bathed regularly. It was part of their religious duties to do so. They had quite good teeth. They didn't have orthodontics yet, but they had quite good teeth. Teeth get really bad when you get sugar arriving later on. So in the 18th century is where you get terrible teeth, and people are having their teeth pulled. In fact, many young women on their 18th birthday might have their teeth pulled and a new set of false teeth as their 18th birthday gift, which is quite an extreme. I prefer an Xbox or a, you know. But that's sort of 18th century culture of what's called the Smile Revolution. There's a great book by Colin Jones about this, about the fact that the first smile in art history is by a French artist, a self-portrait called Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun. And it's her going, grinning, and everyone's like, what the hell are you doing? We do not smile in paintings. Because nobody had their teeth, right? So, so yeah, I guess that the sort of, yeah, the fact that medieval people were dirty is, because again, you're sort of dehumanizing the past and just sort of making out everyone was, it's a Monty Python thing, right, isn't it? How do you know he's the king? He's not covered in shit. But yeah, people in the past washed. Oh no, that's a good, that's such a, I get one day. Oh, man. Am I safe? Am I sort of in a sort of little bunker so I can watch it from afar? Because I mean, there's some big ones, but I'd probably get caught up in some sort of massive fighting. I don't know. That's a really good question. Oh no, there's so many days in history. I think, I mean, the classic is obviously the moon landing, but like, I think it would have been really extraordinary, maybe to have just witnessed Imperial Rome at its pomp or something, or to see, I don't know, to see a vast city of people all congregating for one thing. So, I don't know, maybe oh no, the fall of Constantinople, there we go, fall of Constantinople, 1453. Terrifying, scary, but a sort of enormously important moment in world history, because it had stood for 1,125 years, and then it was like done in an afternoon, because the Ottoman Turks had cannons, and no one had thought about cannons before. That would be scary to see, but probably a kind of momentous occasion. Oh, that's such a difficult. No. Do you want to ask me about something like toilets, underpants? No. I think we're living in a really complicated age where I think the subject is being pulled in so many directions, and there are basic tenets of history that you're all very educated and you've come to a talk, so well done you. But there are many people I encounter who don't even know what history is, and history is the intellectual exercise of thinking about the past. It's not the same as the past. The history and the past are different things. The past is unchangeable. You need a time machine or a DeLorean. History changes every day. We rewrite history every time we write a new book. Catherine's book is excellent. I highly recommend it. It's brilliant. But history is always changing, which means it's always contested, which means it's always being fought over, sometimes politely, and sometimes in these sort of ongoing culture wars where governments or vested interests want to push an agenda or they want to pursue a certain angle, and other people say, no, we want to pursue this angle. And in some ways, that's the lifeblood of history. The fact that people are fighting over it suggests that it's valuable and important, and it shapes how we think of ourselves and our society and who we want to be. And in some ways, we should celebrate that. And in other ways, it's deeply depressing when things are skewed and deliberately mangled to pursue a particular agenda. And that is why historians do what we do, often in public. That's why I call myself a public historian. So I think in some ways, yeah, it's a sign that history matters, the past matters. And in other instances, it's pretty bleak that there are all these pushbacks, against, for example, the National Trust, doing a report on their houses to find out, about the history of slavery and colonialism and whether that was, which is an important piece of scholarship, doesn't, and if you don't tell those stories, then you are hiding history, you're hiding the past. So, what do you think about this? I don't want to drag you into a culture war, but, as a professor,
Well, I think, around the world, there are some quite serious attacks on history. And if you think, for example, I'll just take one example in Hungary. Yeah. Basically, the Central European University, its teaching of gender history essentially had to close down in Hungary and move to Vienna because of government restrictions there. Similarly, see a lot of politics in Poland around memorialization of the Second World War, government not at all keen to see anything suggesting that Polish people cooperated with the Nazis in any way, even though the historical record shows that in some cases, yes, they did. So there's there are all sorts of issues around the world, and here in the UK, there are a lot. Unfortunately, at the moment, one of the things that we're seeing within universities and higher education is a lot of the kind of smaller university history departments facing cuts and closures because of the way that the sort of free market system that has come in since 2010 has driven the growth of some departments at the expense of others. And although, it's a wonderful kind of world of history out there. The fact that Greg's, podcasts can get so many listeners, as do many other, history broadcasts. So people want to watch his stuff on TV. They buy history books. Publishers are really enthusiastic about commissioning history books. They sell copies. There's a really lively world on the one hand, and on the other, some real challenges to telling the stories.
Yeah, the battle is happening because people care, and that's good. But the battle is often played with dirty tricks and without people being honest about what it is they are doing. And historians, we all come with our own preconceptions and biases and interests and what we want to achieve in our work. But when the government itself is sort of wading into some of these conversations, that is problematic because ultimately historians need to be able to work independently and then publish their findings. So we are going to see more of this. And the big current strategy from journalists is to do FOI requests, so freedom of information, and just deluge universities and public bodies with these FOIs in the search for some sort of story. So just this week, for example, archaeology students, the Telegraph splashed archaeology students are sort of getting trigger warnings ahead of when they interact with skeletons, skeletal human material. It's not new. I had that in 2002 when I first did an archaeology degree. I did an osteology course, and I had a trigger warning ahead saying you're going to be handling human remains. You're going to see a person who is dead. They died of cancer. You're going to see that cancer. You're going to see the arthritis in their bones. You're going to feel their skull. You're going to measure their limbs, treat them with respect, And this is something that will happen to you one day. We all die. And it's moving and powerful when someone hands you a human body and asks you to think about it scientifically. I had that trigger warning 20 years ago because it's normal. And there's currently a thing about woke students who, it's like, no, if you're going to talk about painful, difficult subjects, give someone a heads up. It doesn't cost them anything. So, yeah, there is a bigger war coming, sadly, but history is in rude health, which is why the war is choosing history as a battleground, I think.
Right, and on that rather serious note, I think we do need to end.
But
also, there are lots of jokes in the book, so do either buy a copy of your book or request it at your local library, where I'm sure they'll be happy to help you out, get a copy. And Greg's new book will, I believe, be out for Christmas.
Yeah, the kids' book is it's out in November, I think.
Wonderful. So,
or October or something.
Yes.
Later,
soon, but in time for Christmas, so do look out for that. And thanks again for coming. Thanks for all your questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your questions.